Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I'm thrilled to have with me back again, Jeff DeGraff, the Dean of Innovation, professor at the University of Michigan, and someone who's worked with more than half of the Fortune 500 companies, getting them to get more out of their innovation programs and the creativity of their people. Jeff, it's wonderful having you back again.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me on. Good to see you.
Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode.
So we talked about your background the last time, but what's been new in your life over the last sort of 3 years? What have you been up to?
Well, a couple things. First of all, I'm a grandfather. That kind of matters. It's a new thing in my life. I have a new book out, The Creative Mindset, which I wrote with my wife. We built another innovation lab. We have another innovatorium. And I'm working on one of the largest projects I've ever worked on in my life, and that is building the innovation ecosystem for the United States military.
Oh, wow. I mean, what better place to start than there? I think if you're going to look at one organization that probably has the budget to do innovation, has a track record with departments doing innovation, but also probably is in some of the most need of innovation, it's probably the U.S. military.
Yes, but you can imagine a lot of that I can't talk about.
Oh, of course.
I will talk about what I can, yeah.
So what's your involvement there? What are they setting out
well,
to achieve?
the big issue, obviously, is that as the world conflicts turn more into the digital age and they start looking outside of our own environment, there needs to be new solutions and new ways of handling that. The whole geopolitical situation in the world these days is very fluid. So, some of those bridges need to be built or rebuilt. And the biggest thing about all of this is that when I came up, there was a symbiotic relationship between the government, academia, and the military and businesses. And that's really always been the American model. And over the years, that's kind of, that's eroded a little bit. So how do we put that back together? And obviously my work on the business side with very large companies sort of brought me into how do we do this in the military sphere, not only the United States, also some other places around the world. But basically, how do we take all of the kind of new thinking and apply it into places that are keeping us all safe?
And what sort of challenges, obviously non-disclosure agreements aside, what sort of challenges are they facing? You'd think that someone who has entire departments focused on innovation with all the resources in the world, literally,
they have the same challenges.
This quite easy.
Same challenges every large organization I've ever been in have. Three challenges, and it doesn't matter whether we're dealing with governments trying to handle COVID, or it's the exact same challenges with any large bureaucracy. Number one, speed. How do we move from bench to the front line to synchronization? How does this all go together? That becomes an enormous issue. And three, do you have the culture that supports this in these functional hierarchies? So, what happens is that those incredible entrepreneurs and innovators learn to hide, and they often hide in plain sight. So, in some ways, it's not any different than coming back to Apple in '97. It's, I've seen this movie a million times. So even though things are different and the stakes are certainly higher, it's not about producing another soda. This is all about, are we all going to be safe? But the issues are fundamentally the same as any organization.
So I think the military is one fascinating thing to talk about, but there's so much more we can talk about, especially you said you're also working on another incubator innovation lab. What's that?
I built the first innovatorium. Some of your listeners know I'm one of the guys that built Domino's Pizza. So when I was really a young man, and I built my first incubator with Apple. And this is when Steve Jobs is being pushed out. And it was called at the time AppleNet, which then had a child called Connect, which then had a child called iTunes, right? So this was the beginning of these digital incubators, which are called COINs, Collaborative Open Innovation Network. So, I go way back. And what happened was we had built this first one probably 20 years ago, and then you got the D School at Stanford, and then you got WeWorks. A lot of things kind of look the same. I'm not saying they're copies of my work, but they're certainly iterations of the same kinds of things, right? What I'm trying to do now is quite interesting. I'm trying to develop a curriculum, and this new book is really part of this, for people who normally are forgotten in the innovation sphere. So a lot of the books on creativity and innovation basically have two sort of pedigrees. The first is, how to make another $1 billion. Well, look, and don't get me wrong, I'm in that business, but I didn't really feel like writing a book for that group. I feel like they've already know how to do that. The other is kind of, there's a lot of new age thinking kind of stuff, which I think is great for being inspirational. I'm actually in favor of it, but I'm not sure it's going to help the person. What I really wrote the book for was the person who's trying to do a side hustle, person who's trying to make their life a little better and new. Maybe somebody's trying to figure out how to manage all this at home. That person, because I was that person when I was a kid. I came up as a Teamster. I grew up in a HUD house, and I understand it's hard to make your dream happen when you're kind of, you're trying to live hand to mouth. So what I did in the book and in the new Innovatorium, right? What I did was I took a lot of what would be top researchy stuff around how to think, and I turned them into sort of pithy little things to remember that that a person who is just trying to make their restaurant better would know. And then the second thing I did was I looked at all of the basic skills, not just steps, but skills that I noticed over the years. And I was really, I've been super lucky in my career and who I've gotten to see and sort of advise or be around, I guess is a better way of putting it. And what I tried to do was to say, here are the 6 skills and here are some simple methods. So that becomes sort of the basis of the book. And then if you want to see what I call see one, do one, teach one, if you want to see how it's done, you go to my website, you download the videos, you download the slides, you try it with your church group, you try it with your small business, you try it in your incubator, and you see how many of the 6 skills you can actually master.
Now, yeah, I think the side hustle, it's become very trendy, especially with a lot of people saying how much money you can earn online with such little work. I'm really not a fan of people who sell that type of lifestyle dream, because I don't think it's really true.
I'm not saying it that way. No, what I'm saying is innovators normally have one foot in something that they have to do to make rent. And I want you to think about, the single mom who's going to school at night. I want you to think of the guy who's, who's an electrician, but he's got aspirations of having his own company someday. So when I talk about side hustle, I'm really talking about trying to get off the ground that thing that you've always wanted to do, that dream you've had. So I'm using it in that sense. I'm older. So I think the way my generation looked at it. So, and I'm a big believer that, we have this notion of doing everything at once, which is just a terrible mistake. The way this works is you build version 1, and version 1, kind of works, and it gives you enough inspiration to go to version 2, and somewhere around, I don't know, version 7 or 8, I don't know what version I'm on, Nick, but somewhere around one of those later versions, people go, oh, wow, this really works. This is great. And you're like, well, you weren't here for version 1.
Or people find out at version 2 or 3 that what they thought was going to be their perfect job is not actually what they want to do.
Yeah, in fact, that's a big issue. And the first step, I created this mnemonic device and talking about the skills. And the first skill is clarify. And one of the biggest problems I find in over 35 years of doing this is most people get the problem wrong. That's the biggest challenge out of everything. They get the space wrong completely. And because they get the space wrong, we've all had the experience of working really hard on a solution. It turned out not to really be a solution. I have a great story around this. I worked on a project when I was really, really young for something called Applied Integrated Systems. There was a group of us, we were advising Steve Jobs. And Alan Kay and this group created this project called the Zeno Project, which was trying to teach literacy to in South Central Los Angeles, which had at the time about a 30% illiteracy rate. And these were when the big laser discs. Your listeners probably don't remember the big ones. But we were trying to teach them how to read by teaching them how to get an S-class truck driver's license, because we naturally assumed that somebody would want to get a job like that. What we noticed was it didn't change literacy at all. And about 10 years later, I read a biography of one of my relatives, a guy named C.R.E.A.T.E, who invented paperback books, created a company called Pocketbooks. And he in his biography, it's called Two Bits, a two-bit culture. He believes that putting a 25-cent book in a vending machine at a train station will, in the 1930s, will take these illiterate people and they'll help them become literate, which of course I did as well. So the point I was trying to make is that we all worked really hard and spent a lot of money in our best effort, but we were solving the wrong problem. And you can see this everywhere where if we think iPads are going to solve poverty problems and, you know, the Kalamazoo Promise where we pay everybody to go to college, we think that's going to shrink the achievement gap. These are great examples of, you know, necessary, but not sufficient. That's not really the problem.
So what should people do? A lot of advice on the internet is follow your passion, follow your dream, and
please don't.
Yeah.
So this is, I'm an old Midwesterner, okay? So you just have to kind of know we're a little rough around the edges, but when somebody tells me, I want to tell you what I want to do, my first response is, I'm not interested in that. I'm not. Because, you know, all you have to do is watch American Idol auditions and watch somebody, you know, caterwaul, and, you know, 3 million YouTube views later, nobody loved that person enough to say, this really isn't your thing. On the other hand, what I want your listeners to think about is, what am I designed to do? Now, that's a different question. And that's an issue about what are your skills? Now, whether they're ordained by God or they're learned through experience and experiments, what is it that you have that's unique to you, that you're really special? So the good news, Nick, is that everybody has one of those, or maybe two if you're a genius, right? The bad news is that most of the time what we end up doing something very different than what's in our own wheelhouse. And what you find is that really great innovators, they conform their innovations and their companies to represent what's unique about them.
So what is, in your view, the point of a side hustle? Is it always to find something that could grow into a job that becomes your full-time work? Or is it in some cases something that gives you a sense of achievement that you wouldn't necessarily get in the job that you do full-time?
I like where you're going with this. I'm not sure it's achievement. I would use the word meaning. I think we're here to make meaning. And I think a side hustle gives us energy, right? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to be enlivened in our lives. We're trying to wake up. And when we get energy and we're doing something positive, other people around us get energy. So we have a very positive, and the most incredible creative people I've ever met are my parents, you know, and we didn't have a lot of money. And their ability to sort of do amazing things without money, and I see this all the time in underserved populations, I think is a great use of our creativity. It can't all be about, you know, making another $1 billion. Now, don't get me wrong. This is where my hypocrisy shows, because that's why people hire me, right? To do that. This book is in a different vein. This book is all about how do I get that person? How do I get that person who's just trying to make their life a little better and new? How do I get them on the road to doing that? The democratization of innovation. So
there's 6 skills in the creative mindset. I think you mentioned getting clarity was one of them. What are the other ones?
Well, it's a mnemonic device. So C.R.E.A.T.E. Replicate, which is where we're going to see, actually there's an old, Aristotle writes about it, calls it mimesis, right? Biomimicry, things like that. You know, and then we go to E, which is elaborate, which of course Arthur Kessler back in the early 60s wrote The Act of Creation, calls it bisociation. Artists call it defamiliarization. It's brainstorming, but with structure and understanding how that really works, because most brainstorming is really poorly done. A, which is associative, which is now getting more sophisticated. One of the interesting things your brain does is adaptive reasoning. It takes clusters, it puts things together that become more than just a bunch of sort of ridiculous one-off ideas. They start to look like a solution. And your brain actually works backwards too, which is once you create a metaphor or an analogy, you can also turn it inside out. And this is how I think in large systems, you start to see opportunities that other people overlook. I think these are incredibly valuable innovations when you get to that level. Translate, and you know this better than anybody. Can you tell a good story? Can you build a story from the standpoint of the listener? And even more so, can you build beyond scenario making? Can you use morphologies or taking attributes and functions and putting them together in ways, which incidentally is a very complicated cognitive operation. It's very difficult to do effectively and to get it to be simple. So people, when they look at the competing values framework and the innovation genome or the innovation code, sort of my early work, they often go, this is deceptively simple. And you have to laugh and go, yeah, because it took us all, the four of us, it took us 30 years to get us to this state. And then finally, evaluate. And you've seen this in your work too. I mean, how many times have you seen, people either try and boil the ocean and extract gold, or they try and turn the dial one dot and they think that's going to change everything? How do you actually get that idea the right size so it can get to scope and scale? And that becomes sort of the jumping off point. And and I know that's the biggest challenge. How do you then move from design thinking, which is nice, but it's necessary but not sufficient, to all the way to getting this large? A great example of this, of course, is the 595 shots on goal for COVID. And now we're in the final hunt on 6 of them. I think we'll have about 16 when we're done. But the real issue is going to be, how do we get 14 billion doses made and delivered around the planet? And that becomes a very different kind of activity. You can't use the same tools.
No, absolutely. I really like one of the things you talked about in one of the 6 aspects. You said it took us a lot of time to figure out how simple it was, but a lot of people confuse simple and easy. Something can be simple and still be really hard. And I think that's one of the challenges that a lot of people face with innovation.
Yeah, what's the famous Oliver Wendell Holmes? He says, anybody who comes to simplicity first, their idea is worthless. And he said, anybody who comes to simplicity, I paraphrase, of course, after complexity, their idea is invaluable. And I think that's true. I think most of the time when people talk about simplicity, they're talking about, what we used to call simpletons in the old days. You don't understand this idea very well. And if you start thinking about things like energy, or, alternative energy, alternative food, things like that, most of the ideas that are simple are simple. And the ideas that are really robust are ones that have kind of gone through looking at all the complexity and the patterns and sort of finding that meta pattern at the other end that's going to allow us to do this. And that takes a lot of work. That's heavy lifting.
One of my favorite examples of that is Bill Gates is investing a lot in his philanthropic work around sanitation. And one of the challenges he had is inventing a new toilet system for rural worlds that aren't necessarily hooked up to the sewage system. And you saw some of the finalists for what had been developed as toilets, and some of these were room-sized mechanisms with solar panels and dried fuel generators that ended up just, you knew that they were going to fall apart within about 2 days of being in operation. And then on the other end, there was a couple of simple solutions that were a lot more scalable.
Yeah, I think that's, well, if you think about anything, people love gadgets and they're sort of stuck in the design thinking mode. There was a wonderful innovation a number of years ago. Honda developed a jet with a very different kind of engine, very environmentally safe. The price point was about a third of what a normal jet would be. And everybody said, well, we're all going to be flying around. And I had to laugh because I said, 1938, Henry Ford. And they said, what? I said, 1938, Henry Ford did this with a light aircraft. And Henry Ford was convinced we were all going to fly. And incidentally, that's why when the war came, they were able to mass produce bombers, B-1 bombers, right up the road here. What was interesting is that in order to make that work, what do you have to have? You have to have pilots and fuel and a zillion more airports and air traffic control. And it's going to be the same thing with electric cars. Everybody driving around their little Tesla and going, this is great. Well, Henry Ford had to make a deal with the devil. This was John Rockefeller, because he had to fuel them. So this became Standard Oil. John Rockefeller had a whole bunch of congressmen in his pocket. He had to go get roads built. So whenever you do something, you have to look downstream and upstream. Most innovations actually start in material science. They don't start with the gadget. And most innovations are only viable because they plug into an existing system and can morph that system. If everything's got to be new, most of that stuff never works.
I'd like to take it back to something else that you're working on, which is your incubator program, and especially your history with incubators and innovation labs. Just because from my perspective, being in the industry, I've seen quite a strong backlash over the last 3 to 5 years from corporates who were fascinated by the innovators solution, setting up separate innovation labs, and have not seen the success that was promised to them or that they expected.
Yeah.
What's been your view on innovation labs over the last couple of years? Do you think they're still on the right track, or do they need to reframe what they're meant to do?
It's not that they need to reframe. You have to understand what that tool was developed to do. So let's give the brief history here. Obviously, one of the innovation lab comes out of the whole idea of the big R&D lab. You know, so you think about, General Electric's GRC or IBM's Palisades or whatever it is in your part of the world. And the idea there, the problem there is that these big areas of innovators become orphans. And you can see this in any large institute all around the world. And so they invent a bunch of stuff, but it's not applicable, doesn't relate to anyone, and it takes a long time to get to where people want to go. So what they liked about the incubator was you took it outside, you turned it into more project management. And this is where you get all the lean stuff. And like I said, I'm an old hack at this, right? 30 some years at it. I was there at the beginning of this. And I actually knew Kelly Johnson and the whole original Skunkworks team at Lockheed and so on and so forth. So here becomes the problem. It's the problem with design thinking. The problem is it's one thing to invent something. It's much harder to sell it. And it's far harder to move the soft tissue of the organization to do it at scale en masse. And so the problem is incubators are only good at the first piece. They're not good at the second and third piece. And the problem is it's like a hammer, a wrench, a saw, and a screwdriver. They're not interchangeable. You've got to use it in a different way. So incubators are very good at the top of the funnel. Venture capitalists have a good grasp of this. And I come back to the 595 shots on goal we had for COVID, right? This is the notion of what the governments couldn't do because they had an event that fell outside of their control span, right? We've seen very hacked solutions coming out of Beijing and Moscow, right? These are not good solutions. These are kind of very patchworky things. What you're going to see come out of this is there's going to be 6 right now that are in final stage. And let's say by the time January rolls around, there'll be about 12 to 16 of these. And the notion is how many are really going to stop this thing? Maybe in generation 2 September, we're going to see 3 of them. But the notion is, at the front end of this, it looks like an incubator. At the front end, they're what I call creativity clusters. They're people like you and me trying to solve a problem with our buddies, with our besties. But as you get farther down that track, the money gets bigger. You have to optimize. The whole playbook looks completely different. So things like when people love to say, because I famously started writing about 30 years ago about the problems of stage gating systems and portfolio management. And, I do a lot of work on Wall Street with this. There's a place for them. It's just not at the front. It's at the back, right? That they're very useful at the back. So the problem, Nick, people have is they have this one size fits all mentality, right? So the incubator is going to solve all their problems. How many times have you seen something come out of an incubator, including some of the famous design firms, that was unbuildable, that was not manufacturable? And in fact, something that costs very little to design may cost an insane amount to manufacture. This becomes the problem that you were talking about with the Gates Foundation. It's the problem with the X Prize. It's a problem with a lot of stuff. It's a problem in places like the energy industry, where you see all these kind of small solutions at the beginning, but there's no way Pacific Gas and Electric is going to be able to do that, or Con Edison, or some of the big places around the world. So you have to have all of those stations along the way synced up. And you have to have a line of sight from the beginning to the end. You have to have a line of sight from the end to the beginning. That's the challenge. That's what you have to do in these lines.
I totally agree with you. I think it's especially true when you need to do handovers between people who are skilled at doing the idea generation and design and refinement and customer research. And then the hardest handover is when it needs to impact the company, and especially if it needs to change the company and change the core operations.
Think about where you're at in Germany. Think about how much of what we consider to be the electric vehicle and clean tech came out of Mercedes, an enormous amount of it. People don't even know this. Mercedes Daimler got their way in front of everybody else did. Their problem was just what you said, the handoffs. The handoffs kill you. because the handoffs are changes in culture and they're changes in capability. They're very different people. The person who's gonna design that new toilet and the person who's gonna build the stupid thing is a whole bit different group of people.
Measured on different KPIs. There's a lot of issues there. That's why I'm a big proponent for portfolios, but also for ambidextrous organizations where you bring the people impacted as far into the front of the funnel, at least on a touching basis, as early as possible.
But that gets back to mindset issues. And that's where I start the book. It gets back to, are you thinking about this the right way, right? And I come back to some really big, simple things about this, such as, are you looking for disconfirming feedback or confirming feedback? And I'd be the first to tell you, Nick, I'm a total hypocrite. I hate disconfirming feedback. I hate it. I hate it. I can't sleep when I get it. I think I'm going to win, and somebody tells me this isn't going to work. But if you look at my labs, they're all extremely diverse. And it's not just this kind of diversity. It's all kinds of cognitive, skill-wise diversity. So what happens in those situations is you think you got a mousetrap, and you're getting disconfirming feedback. So what happens is the people who get it wrong, the people who are on your social media page who like you really aren't that helpful, right? The people who give you feedback and say, hey, wait a minute. And why that's important is because so much of creativity and innovation is produced through constructive conflict. And we know when we study these 20, 30 places around the planet that produce almost all the intellectual property, we know that they're more diverse in their adjacent areas. And the reason isn't because we're compromising. It isn't because we're so smart. It's because when you push against each other, you have two choices. You can either yell across the fence like we're doing in our politics in America right now, which is worthless. I mean, that's not going to create anything for anybody. Or what you're seeing coming back to the same way that our government failed in terms of handling this virus, and so did our universities and everybody else. But this other group that learned to create constructive conflict, create hybrids, they're the ones who are creating the vaccines. And so I think what's been interesting in this whole discussion is that there's a mindset to innovate, and then there's the mindset that tries to align, that doesn't innovate.
Jeff, I think we could keep talking for hours and hours on the topic, but we're coming up to the end now, unfortunately. If people want to find out more about you, your new book, and the work that you do, what's the best place they can go and do that?
Well, first thing is Creative Mindset. It's now out on Amazon, so you can get it. We made it a paperback, so it's inexpensive. There's also an audiobook and digital book. The big thing is that there's a number of resources for free. I can't emphasize this enough because I really wrote this for people to have free resources. They're at jeffdegraff.com. jeffdegraff.com. Go to the resource page. You'll see where to download all this stuff. No one's going to bother you. There's 15 videos, all the slides, the whole 9 yards. So you can do this yourself is why we're doing this. If somebody wanted to follow me, I'm one of the original 25 LinkedIn influencers, right? You can go to LinkedIn and see what kind of nonsense I'm up to on a regular basis. Who knows? Who knows? I'm usually writing about something that's either I think is funny or it's kind of a burr in my saddle these days. But you can find it anywhere. And the big thing is I just really want to encourage people to make innovation happen where they're at. And I really want the democratization of innovation. I want us to take back our ability to be creative on an individual basis.
A wonderful message for people to live by. Jeff, it's been wonderful speaking with you. I'll make sure to get all of those links down in the description below. I've had a really good time speaking with you, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Thanks, Nick. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave me a comment about what you thought and what you'd like to see more about. If you want to take your creativity and innovation capabilities to the next level, then invest in yourself with the premium training only available at idea2value.com. These exclusive training modules have all been put together by me, Nick Skillicorn, and have been used by thousands of artists, innovation leaders, and CEOs to become better at understanding the source of their creativity and executing on their innovation ambitions. And there is no risk to you, as they're backed by our money-back guarantee. Now, don't forget to go out there and make your ideas a reality. See you again soon.